Hello again, and welcome to the St. Louis Blues Hockey Legends Podcast. Tom Calhoun here to shine a light on the stories of those instrumental in blues history. My guests on this episode are John and Daniel Patrick Kelly, sons of the late, great Dan Kelly. Many will say there was nobody more instrumental in putting blues hockey on the map in the minds of St. Louis sports fans than their Hall of Fame broadcaster father. The Dan Kelly story, coming right up. St. Louis Blues Hockey Legends is supported by Offenburg Hyundai. Visit offenburghyundai.com. Bellowman. If comfort is your plan, call the Bellowman or visit bellowman.com. And by Stubborn German Brewing Company, Waterloo, Illinois. stubborngermanbrewing.com. And welcome once again, everybody. This episode is all about remembering and honoring the late, great Dan Kelly, who passed in 1989. But before he did, and while the voice of the blues in St. Louis, he became known as perhaps the greatest hockey play-by-play broadcaster of his time and maybe of all time. We'll get into that a little bit and why that's true as we go along and discuss Dan's story with his sons, John and Dan. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Hi, Tom. How are you doing?
Blues fans know, of course, that John has been handling the call on Blues television since 04-05. After some stints with the Lightning and Avalanche before that, and could already be considered a blues legend himself, but that's a podcast for another time, and we'll get to that at some point in time. Daniel Patrick Kelly is John's younger brother and former radio broadcaster of the Blues, Blue Jackets, and Chicago Blackhawks, among other entries on his resume. Dan, you might update us a little bit on your current business, what you're up to these days.
Still do some occasional soccer, but mostly what I do now is call some games for the Big Ten Network. I think it's my 14th or 15th year there. That's where we're going to, January 3rd and 4th, we're going to call some of the outdoor games, the Frozen Confines Big Ten series. So that's where I usually get after it in terms of play-by-play and sticking around the game of hockey.
Well, it's good to have you both on. And as we begin reminiscing about your dad, let's start a little bit north of the border, if we can, and talk about the family situation that Dan had up in Ottawa. John, you might be more comfortable talking about this since you were part of the family move from Ottawa to St. Louis. Can you talk about how Dan grew up, maybe your grandparents a little bit, aunts and uncles, family situation up there in Ottawa?
Yeah, Tom, it's a really great story that my father achieved what he did in his career because he grew up in, I would consider, a modest household. And unfortunately, his father, who was a policeman in Ottawa, died when my dad was about 2 or 3 years old. So he really never got to know his dad. So my grandmother had to work a couple of jobs to support my father and his siblings, but he was the youngest of four and or five, right, Dan? He had three brothers, right? So he was the youngest of five. He had a sister and three brothers. Two of the brothers were killed in the war, and his oldest brother Hal, who was a broadcaster as well, he actually did some blues games back in the early '70s with my dad.
Yeah,
and he worked in other NHL for NHL teams. So he got my dad into the broadcasting business because, as I said, he was 16 years older than my father. So he was already an accomplished broadcaster in Toronto, Ontario. And then my dad never went to college, and out of high school, he wanted to be a broadcaster. And his late sister was a nun up in the Ottawa area. She passed away a couple of years ago. So that was his family history. Again, no father. And he started in a small town called Smiths Falls, Ontario, which is probably a couple of hours from Ottawa. He was a DJ spinning records, and on the side he started doing hockey games, and then went to Sudbury, Ontario, another small town, and then back to Ottawa, where he started to really ascend and work for the CBC affiliate, the number one TV station. And then, did some radio for the Montreal Canadiens, and then got on Hockey Night in Canada as the host. But he really wanted to do play-by-play. And then when the Blues made him an offer in the summer of '68. Of course, he came here, and I guess the rest is history. But he really came from very little, Tom, and made his way onto the scene here in St. Louis, and then obviously with CBS and other venues. But it's really quite a story that he came from so little.
Tom,
That
Tom,
is
I would
quite
just
a
add to
story, and
that.
I don't think anybody's heard that part of his story before. At least I haven't. So, Dan, you were going to say?
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to add to that. I think his nickname in Sudbury when he was a DJ was Disco Dan. And just about our late Uncle Hal, who John mentioned, and I think was kind of a mentor to my father, was older than him, and was already established in the business, doing television, calling play-by-play for baseball and hockey. And when he first heard my dad's audition tapes when he was young, and as he called him, he was basically an Ottawa hick, the way he sounded. It says you're never going to make it, and he obviously made it and polished up pretty nicely.
Yeah, he sure did. So, John, your early years were in Ottawa, right? And then moved to St. Louis when Dan came to St. Louis. You have any memories of that transition from Ottawa to St. Louis?
Yeah, I was 8 at the time, Tom, and I remember the summer very well when the Blues were courting him. And obviously, Scotty Bowman is the one who recommended my father to the Solomon family
I was going to
and
bring
to
that
the
up.
late Robert Hyland, the former GM of KMOX Radio. But it was a tough decision for my dad because all of his family was in Ottawa. My mother is from Ottawa, and she had a large family there. So to move and to have at the time, Dan was born in St. Louis. He's the only one of our kids that was born in St. Louis. 5 kids in a family and a lot of extended family in Ottawa. It was not an easy decision. I know he also had talked to the Minnesota North Stars, Tom,
Hmm.
about going to Minnesota to become their voice. But it really came down to the Blues and the Sullivan family, and they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And he accepted the job for the start of the '68-'69 season. And our family did not move down. I'm talking about my mother and the kids until December because our house wasn't ready. The house we bought off of Olive Boulevard in Old Farm Estates. So the kids all stayed there in Ottawa until December, and then we moved down. We stayed in a hotel for a few weeks right near the arena, and then moved into our house. So yeah, I remember it well. It was not an easy decision, but again, I know that the Solomons and Scotty were very persuasive, and I think my dad made the right choice.
And he made sure there was a Chinese restaurant in town,
Yes.
I understand.
Yeah, Dan knows that story, right, Dan?
Yeah, exactly. It's been told a few times.
Yeah, apparently, Sid Solomon said, "Yeah, we'll build you a Chinese restaurant if that's what it takes to get you here," right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Dan, you were born in St. Louis, as John mentioned, and your dad would have been on the road a lot with the team. But I would imagine, knowing Dan a little bit myself, that he was pretty invested in you kids at home whenever he got a chance to be with you. And I know your mom, Fran, a bit as well, and I know she would have kept you guys on track. So, big family, but what kind of a dynamic was there with Dad on the road so much?
But he made sure when he was around that he was there. Like for instance, he used to just shut things down in the summer and go to his cottage in Canada on a beautiful lake for about 6 weeks. Maybe do a baseball game in Montreal or sports open line from the cottage. But that's about it. And I can just remember like what a dedicated father he was. He could not stand fishing, but he would get up lo and behold at 5 a.m. and read a book and cringe when I'd get a fish in the boat and all of that. But that's the type of father that he was. Just to make sure, since he knew he was on the road for heck, he was doing 120 games. Oftentimes, and they're traveling commercial back then. So and other sports as well. So. He was gone a lot, but the coolest thing too, Tom, is John was reminding me today when we were talking briefly about this, about this call, is that John didn't really have a chance to go on the road with him. Well, I was the youngest of six, so maybe it's almost like a premonition my father had in the back of his mind that maybe he wouldn't be around forever. So I went to Boston Garden, Chicago Stadium numerous times, playoff games, Joe Louis Arena. The list goes on. Maple Leaf Garden. I can just keep going on. Winnipeg like 4 times because that's the only place the Blues used to charter. So to spend time with him in airplanes and hotels and of course the broadcast booth, just to see, just to see his presence every day around people and the reaction that he got. And of course, going to Legendary Steakhouse was always part of it. I was reminded traveling to Minnesota for hockey 2 years ago. I know John visited this restaurant as well, called Murray's, home of the Butter Knife Steakhouse. Legendary place, has been around since the 50s or 60s. So I popped in there and just was asking questions about I guess it was the manager or maitre d', and said, my father used to come in here a long time ago, and he nicely, asked who he was, and I told him, and he's like, well, I was about 16 years old then. He was the son of the manager, and he remembers, yeah, he used to come in with Ron Caron and Teddy Hampson, the former director of scouting, just to remember him after all these years. And then to further add to that story, I ran into Susie Matthew, and she said, oh yeah, we used to go to Murray's Steakhouse with your dad all the time. Of course, Susie Matthews, the Wonder Woman that used to kind of run the Blues. And she mentioned they went there with a big group, and it was around, I think, when Mr. Ornest owned the team, and the credit card kind of got rejected. Susie tried to buy dinner, and my dad had to foot the bill. I'm sure he sent the expenses into Oakland Avenue, though.
Yeah, Susie's going to be my next guest on the podcast, by the way, in a couple of weeks. So I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome.
So let's talk about the professional side of things for a little bit. Jack Buck handled play-by-play the first year of the Blues, and I think everybody realized, including Jack, that he wasn't really cut out for that. And so the search was on for somebody to come in for that 68-69 season, like you mentioned, John. And Dan was already recognized, as you said, as a pretty big deal doing Hockey Night in Canada up there in Canada. But he had other options, like you said. Minnesota was also courting him, right?
Yeah, and as I said, it was a tough decision because, even though he was the host of Hockey Night in Canada, that's a big deal up there, Tom. I mean, that is the biggest show up there every Saturday night, and he was the host. He also did a Grey Cup for CBC, which is, of course, the Super Bowl of the Canadian Football League. So he was well established as a broadcaster, but his number one goal from the time he wanted to become a broadcaster was to be an NHL play-by-play guy. So even though he was doing a few games on radio, I think on Sunday nights for the Canadians, and he was on Hockey in Canada as a host, he really, really wanted to be a play-by-play guy. And at the time, the number one play-by-play guy was a gentleman by the name of Danny Gallivan,
Right.
who was a legend up in Canada. I mean, he, to me, is on the Mount Rushmore of hockey broadcasters. And my dad knew that Danny Gallivan was in his prime and wasn't going anywhere in the near future. So when the NHL expanded and there were 6 more teams added, including the Blues, and my dad had a couple of opportunities, he was probably thinking, well, I can maybe wait here in Canada and maybe someday I'll replace Danny Gallivan, or I can take a chance and go to St. Louis and be a play-by-play guy right now. And obviously he chose that decision. He made that decision because, if he would have waited, who knows what would have happened. But I think he made the right call, because the other thing that really worked in his favor was that because KMOX at the time was owned by CBS TV got the rights to the NHL the very next year, and my dad got that job as the number one TV voice, and really the first ever TV voice for the National Hockey League in the United States. So he was sort of in the right place at the right time, working for the right network, and he got that job. And of course, the first year, the Blues played in the final that year that CBS had the rights, and he made the famous Bobby Orr call on CBS on May 10th, 1970. So
Orre for the Bruins, tied up by Ecclestone and Berenson. Westfall rolled it in front. Sanderson tried a shot that was wide, and Keenan cleared it, but not out. Bobby Orr behind the net to Sanderson. Orr! Bobby Orr scores, and the Boston Bruins have won the Stanley Cup. Orr flipping it into the closed goal, and look at the long team by the Bruins as Bobby Orr, their 22-year-old sensation, scores after 40 seconds of overtime.
So it was the right decision for a lot of reasons, including his ability to work for CBS TV.
Yeah, and being at KMOX and part of the stable of people they had then, Jack Buck, Bob Costas, Bob Starr, Dan Deerdorf. I mean, the list goes on and on. And having Bob Hyland on your side on some things, that was pretty important back in those days too.
Yeah, I'm sure that Mr. Hyland influenced the executives at CBS quite a bit. And, it's really quite remarkable that he really just had 1 year of play-by-play under his belt, and he was the guy chosen to be the lead guy. And, after CBS lost the rights, they went to NBC, and then the NHL, had their own network. But then my dad went on to work for USA Network and did some games for ESPN. So he really was the TV voice in the United States for the NHL for, really most of his career in St. Louis. I think what Danny did 16 or 15 Stanley Cup finals, right? So that was pretty remarkable for him to have that, success down here south of the Canadian border.
So we moved down the timeline just a bit, and he made a rather bold move to move over to KXOK radio back in the mid 80s. And of course, KMOX had rights to all the sports teams in town, and occasionally hockey would get bumped to another station. And Dan had the opportunity to go to KXOK, as I did, and Ron Jacober and some other people from KMOX back in those days. And that was really a bold move to go to that station and make the Blues the focus of the sports coverage of that station. Dan, you might remember a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was gutsy. I mean, that was a tumultuous time with the Blues organization. I was remembering today, and I don't know if I probably have mentioned it to John in the past, or if you've even remembered, but like, first off, where would hockey be right now in St. Louis if the team went to Saskatoon? And that was a big realistic fear back in the mid '80s. But I can remember at a time too that the Blackhawks in the early '80s must have been like pre Pat Foley reached out to my father. Could you imagine how history would be changed if Dan Kelly was a Chicago Blackhawk?
Oh, wow.
Doesn't sound right, Dan. It just doesn't sound right, guys?
No.
That just doesn't sound right. That wouldn't have been the right story, that's for sure. And I was lucky enough, as I said, to work at KXOK with Dan and Ron Jacober and some others. And that's how it led to my PA job with the Blues. Dan was instrumental, I think, in talking to Susie Matthew and suggesting me for the PA job. So I'll always have that memory of him as well. He and Ron Jacober called me and said, "Hey, the Blues are looking for a PA guy, and you might want to talk to Susie about that." And so the rest is kind of my history there too. So I'll always thank your dad for that opportunity.
That's awesome. John and Tom, who would have my dad worked with at KXOK? Because I was just wondering, when he worked with Dan Deerdorf for a while as well, I was wondering where that was on the radio.
Yeah, that was at KMOX probably, Dan.
Okay.
But at KXOK, he and Ron Jacober sort of ran the sports department there. But I also recall Dan recruiting Joe Micheletti to do some color broadcasts with the Blues when we were at KXOK. And that kind of got Joe started on his path to becoming a national broadcaster. So your dad had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, I can remember Joe telling the story fondly, when he was even a younger broadcaster. But he said the first game he did with my dad, he walked in there without a pen and paper after the game, piercing eyes, a piercing look from my dad, and says, "If you ever do that again," I don't know the colorful language that he finished it off with, but Joe learned his lesson, and Joe became one of the most prepared, astute broadcasters in the history of the game.
And one of the nicest guys you'll ever run into too.
For sure.
Yeah. So I remember also his professionalism in a journalistic sense, because we had a sports talk show on KXOK in those days, and I occasionally got the chance to host it. And I remember one night after a Blues North Stars game, Minnesota North Stars game, I was hosting, and Dan would come in and do a segment usually on the day after a game and kind of wrap things up and talk about the game the night before. And I don't remember who got into it with Willie Plett of the North Stars, but I managed to call Willie Plett an idiot on the air during that talk show. And right away, Dan said, "Oh, no, Tom, he's not an idiot. He does his job very well, and which told me, he knew the game, he knew the people of the game. I was not that close to it, and I was well corrected and stood corrected on the air at the time, and that was a part of my education back in those days. But he did know the people of the game, how it worked, and stood up for the right people at the right time.
Yeah, Tom, I think that's one of the things that I absorbed from him, learned from him, was to have respect for everybody in the game, whether it's the players, the officials, the coaches, the owners. He always had great respect. I remember he told me a story one time. I think he was doing the game with the late Gus Kyle, his longtime partner, and Gus must have said something about one of the players that my dad didn't like. And I know that he talked to Gus during a commercial break, and he basically said, "Hey, listen, these players' parents are listening because they could listen to the games wherever they lived, pretty much everywhere in Canada except west of the Rockies." And he said, "You can't say that about these guys. Their parents are listening,"
Yeah.
because he knew they were. So again, another example of the class he had. And hey, Gus made a mistake. Gus was a great announcer, and they formed a great team. Don't get me wrong, but again, my father wanted to show the respect that the players deserved in that just one particular instance.
Right.
And Tom, just to add to that, just because I ran into this plaque that Bernie Federko made for my father, 1,000th point against the Hartford Whalers in March of 1998. He gives my dad, a couple months after the season, that puck on a plaque and says, "Thanks, Dan. You've called them all. Hopefully, many more." Tragically, there would only be another year or more, but a guy like Bernie, one that shows how first class he is. But the guys like Bernie Federko, Brian Sutter, the list goes on. They love my father. They respected him. You don't see that nowadays because there's just a singular broadcaster back there. Half the time the games were just on radio. So I think the relationship between the players and a guy like my father, I mean, when they got drafted by St. Louis, they were excited because they knew their parents could pick up KMOX and follow the Blues all season.
Yeah, I've got a quote from Brian Sutter here somewhere on my notes, where he said, "When you came to the Blues, you were not only coming to the Blues, but you were coming to play for Dan Kelly, because Dan Kelly made hockey what it was in St. Louis in those days, and that was a prestige thing for these players."
Yeah, Tom, one year, I can't remember exactly the year it was. It was in the mid '70s when the Blues were not very good. But on the cover of their media guide, they put a picture of my dad and Gus Kyle, and that told me two things. It said, number one, how great they were and how much loved they were by the Blues fans, but also the team wasn't very good that year, so they had to promote the broadcasters, which in a way is too bad. But it was obviously quite an honor. But you'd never see that today. I don't care who it is, what team, what sport. You would not see the broadcasters on the cover of media guide like my dad and Gus Kyle were back in the '70s.
Right. Well, let's move along to Dan's famous zest for life. We talked a little bit about the Chinese restaurant thing, and he knew where all the steakhouses were in North America. He would identify the cities the team was going to by the place he was going to eat after the game most of the time. Can you talk about that a little bit, John?
Yeah, again, Dan, when he was younger, he would travel a lot more with my dad. I went on a
Yeah,
few
maybe
road
Dan could
trips
talk
with
about
my
that. Yeah.
with my dad as a kid. And then when I started my broadcasting career in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is south of Toronto, I would go see my dad on the road when he was in Buffalo or Toronto, and I'd meet him. And you're right, invariably would walk in and they would know him and have a table ready for him and etc. I think Dan told a story the other day at Christmas where, or my sister did, perhaps my sister Susan, that they were in Chicago for a playoff series one time, and I don't know what year it was, but so you're there for whatever 4 or 5 nights because it's a playoff series, and my father went to Gene and Giorgetti's, which is a famous Italian steakhouse in downtown Chicago, one of my dad's favorites. He went to Gene and Giorgetti's 4 consecutive nights, on the off nights, and then again after the games. and he took my mom and my sister Susan. But Tom, who goes to the same restaurant 4 nights in a row? The only person would be someone who loves steak, and that certainly was my dad. But that's the love he had for eating late night after the games. But you're right, he knew everybody around North America, especially in the finer steakhouses, and they obviously knew him.
I remember a few steak dinners with him at the old Arena Club after games back in the day. And
yeah, he used to sit in the back. They used to have a table reserved for him at the very back, and he'd go there every night and have a cold Budweiser and order himself a steak every night.
There's a famous photo of you and Dan, John, in the Dan Kelly press box at Enterprise Center. Do you recall when that photo was taken?
Yeah, Tom, that picture was taken probably maybe our second year in St. Louis. I can't remember the exact date,
You were
but
a little boy at the time, obviously.
I was a real young guy. I was probably 9 years old.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's one of my favorite pictures ever with my dad, where if people who are watching this podcast don't know, I was in the broadcast booth at the old arena with him, and we sort of were looking up at the camera and we had the same pose. And yeah, it's a really special picture. We have it at our house. My mom has it, and as you said, it's up at the Enterprise Center right now in the press box.
Yeah. And Dan, since you traveled with him a lot, you might know if the answer to this one. I'm sure he had Barclay Plager as one of his favorite players back when Bark was still alive. But did he have any favorites that he tended to hang around with on the road?
I don't know if you necessarily hang around the players. You kind of keep a professional distance. Speaking of Barkley, he gave my father his All-Star ring. Talk about a connection, and of course, Barkley unfortunately passed away, from cancer, just like my father. But I just kind of remember him more keeping to himself professionally, in terms of socially, especially those young guys aren't going to those old man steakhouses that he'd hang out at with. I just remember him though as well, like especially all those Canadian cities. It's like mandatory that all the hotels have steamers and saunas. And he would relax on game day after the morning skate and whatnot. It'd be a nice shave and a steam, and of course maybe probably a 2 hour game day nap, because games back then used to start at 8 o'clock. So he had his little routine just like the players. But I know one guy, he just always maybe John might know better because he was around back in the old days. Of course, he was very tight with Red Berenson and all those guys, but he just always loved the way that Brian Sutter played. I think that, in the late 80s, mid 80s, that to me was his favorite player, just the way he played heart and soul.
Yeah, and I think Dan's right, spot on, Tom. My dad on the road, he would go out with the coach after the game, or the general manager, Ron Caron or whomever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
Although early in the years when my dad was, he was 33 years old or so when he took the job. So he was of the same age of a lot of the Blues players back then, the Al Arbors of the world and the Glenn Halls. I mean, those guys were all older players. But my dad did form, as Dan said, a really special bond with Red. And I know in the off season, Red's a huge outdoorsman, and he would take my dad on expeditions down the rivers, float trips and stuff like that. So he would spend time in the off season with, Red and Barkley, and, play some golf with those guys. But certainly on the road during the season, it was really more with the management and the coaches.
I have a favorite soundbite of Dan's that you can find on YouTube, is when he did the player intros on national TV for the 1988 NHL All-Star game that was here at the arena. After I introduced Dan to the crowd, which was off the air, he made sure that I was recognized by thanking me by name as he received the applause of the crowd on national television.
20 years. Mr. Dan Kelly is standing by now to introduce the starting lineups. Let's go to Dan.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Tom Calhoun. I love you. It is my pleasure to introduce the All-Stars of the National Hockey League.
A wonderful memory for me, and I call it up every once in a while just to remember the guy.
Yeah,
That's
I
awesome.
remember watching that game, and ironically, Dan mentioned Barkley. He had died a couple of days before that game, Tom.
Yeah.
And that was a and Barkley was supposed to be one of the honorary captains for that game. So that was a very emotional game for my father and really all of Blues Nation and Blues fans everywhere because, we lost our heart and soul. And ironically enough, it was almost a year to the day that Barkley died that my father died. So and they both died of cancer. So I know that was a very, you mentioned he got a great ovation from the arena crowd, which was spectacular, but it also was a very tough weekend and tough day for my dad and the entire Blues family.
Yeah, it was a tough announcement for me to do the moment of silence for Bark too.
Yeah.
Those are always tough. So you got to do a game with Dan before he did pass, John, in Philadelphia, and there's a story about that too that you might tell.
Yeah, my dad, I worked for 6 years in the minors, Tom, and my last couple of years, I was actually then in Adirondack, which is upstate New York. And my father asked me to come. He wanted me to come and broadcast with him in St. Louis, but I wanted to get to the NHL really on my own. So I didn't want to do it that way. I wanted to get my own job. So as it turns out, in the summer of '88, I got the Rangers radio job as a backup to Marv Albert. So I was still living up in upstate New York. So I was doing the minor leagues at the time. So I would also do about 40 or 50. I did 40 or 50 Ranger games. And it just so happens on the schedule in mid-November of that year in '88, the Rangers played the Flyers, and then 2 nights later, the Blues played the Flyers in Philadelphia. So my father called me up and said, why don't you hang around? And he was going through cancer treatment and things like that. So I said yes. And I remember walking up to the press box with him at the old Spectrum. There was not an elevator to the press box, Tom. And again, he was doing treatments at the time, and I remember vividly, every 10 steps he would have to stop and rest. Take more 10 steps, stop and rest. And he got to the top. He did the first period, and then in the second, he said to me, and this was a surprise. He said, "I want you to do the play-by-play in this period." So I did the play-by-play of the Blues and Flyers, and then he did the third. And two things really to put a bow on the story is the Blues won the game that night. I think it was 3-1. That was their first win in Philadelphia since the big brawl back in the early '70s when the fans attacked Al Arbor, the Plaguers went into the stands, 5 players got arrested, etc. That was the first win in Philadelphia since that game, the brawl game, that night. And it also turns out that was my father's last ever road game. So I got up the next morning and left, and he thanked me for coming and all that. And I'll never forget that night. So I got to work with him. I still think I made the right decision, my career path. But, I think he really wanted that night. And he probably knew that his time was coming to an end as far as broadcasting because, he was, stage 4 cancer, all that. So I think it was a special night for both of us, his last road game.
Yeah, tough times for all of us. And when Dan passed in 1989, I have a quote from Susie Matthew, who we referred to earlier. She, of course, for those who don't know, the first female PR director in pro sports, and she's coming up as our next guest on the podcast. Her quote to the media at the time was, "In my opinion, Dan was the greatest asset this hockey franchise had. He transcended any player or coach or general manager. He helped educate all the fans and to me and to the game of hockey for so long. It leaves a big void in our franchise because he was our franchise." I mean, that is just unbelievably high praise. Of course, he had just passed away, and you're not going to say anything negative, but that's just way over the top praise. But it's accurate praise because he educated all of St. Louis about the game of hockey for those 20 years that he did games, and many of us would not have bought into the sport of hockey, perhaps, if it weren't for your dad and the way he just came through the radio to describe it all.
Yeah, and
Dan, any
you know
reaction from you on that?
No, well, I was thinking, you know who I think of when you start talking about that, a guy obviously who married a St. Louis girl, the greatest hockey player in the world, Wayne Gretzky, who had this tremendous reverence for my father. He called all of his big games, the Canada Cups, the heyday of the Edmonton Oilers when they were collecting Stanley Cups like they were candy. Even to the day on Wayne Gretzky's last game, I think he forgot to mention my father and the late Tom Nee, the ESPN broadcaster who tragically drowned in a pool at a young age. He forgot to mention their names during the broadcast or whatever to John Davidson, who was ever doing the game, and made a call to make sure that got on the air. That shows his class, but he just always had a tremendous amount of respect, like everybody that encountered my father. I guess one story I was just thinking about as well. I did some research. One of the billion awards that my dad won a couple years ago, and I called John Shannon, legendary producer for Hockey Night in Canada, all that, worked all those big games with my father. And I was surprised by this, but I shouldn't be, because, John talked about his tough upbringing and no one was giving him a helping hand getting into this industry. But he called my dad the most competitive person he's ever encountered in the industry. And he's always gave this one story. It was the night before some break in the NHL. My mom and dad, maybe it was the playoffs or after the playoffs, probably that's what it was. And they were going to Hawaii the next day. And it was late at night, so I'm sure my father had a couple and a nice dinner. And he was a little mad though because he didn't get the big interview. I think it was with Mike Bossy, and he was reading the riot act to his good friend and producer, John Shannon, and ended up kind of just hanging up the phone, and they just blew off steam and didn't talk for a couple of days. But she just said that kind of personified, not that my dad was mean, but he was a competitor, and he obviously fought pretty hard to get to that high position that he was at for so many years.
Yeah. Yeah, I experienced some of that competition or competitive nature along the way too. He would always want to break a story when we worked together in radio. If somebody else got a story on the air before Dan, I mean, he was totally pissed about it, and he would let everybody know, that's not supposed to happen. We're supposed to get that on the air first. And if some other radio station or whatever broke a story, he was not a happy guy.
Tom, you mentioned the Susie Matthew and what she said after he passed. If I had $1 for every time a Blues fan has come up to me in my lifetime and said, John, I grew up listening to your dad and Gus Kyle in bed at night with a transistor radio next to my ear. If I had $1 for every fan that said that to me, I could probably retire right now. I'm not kidding.
Loan me
you.
some.
Right. And I did the exact same thing. I had a little black transistor radio, and when I was young, I didn't go to many games, and I would do the exact same thing. So he just had the power of back then, as Dan said, they probably did 10 games on TV a year. So every single night, fans were glued, if they weren't at the game, glued to that radio. And he just impacted so many people, not just in St. Louis. I've had people all over North America say the exact same thing to me. As a matter of fact, that year he passed in '89, I was still doing some minor league games, as I said, and I was in Hershey, Pennsylvania, at the old Hershey Park Arena, and the broadcast position was literally right in the crowd in the upper deck. There were 2 decks in the arena, and between periods, a fan came up to me, and he had come up from the bottom deck just to tell me how much he loved my father. So can you imagine that? A guy in Hershey, Pennsylvania, who knew that I worked for Adirondack. How he knew that, I don't know. And he made the time and the effort to come up and say how much he loved my father as a broadcaster. It just a little quick story, but again, how impactful he was, not just in St. Louis, but around North America.
No question. Yeah. Lester Patrick Award, the NHL's highest honor for contributions to hockey off the ice, inducted into the Broadcasters Wing of the Hockey Hall of Fame, inducted into several other halls of fame, including the Blues Hall of Fame. So there wasn't an award for a broadcaster that Dan Kelly didn't win. So that speaks to his impact as well. I asked this of all the guests, and as we begin to wrap things up, I'll ask this of all the guests on this podcast, and I'll ask it a different way for you. What would you like your dad's legacy to be? I think his legacy is secure with all those awards and everything. But how maybe do you remember your father, if you can capsulize it? Dan, let's start with you.
First and foremost, great father, great husband, great human being, just the greatest hockey broadcaster that ever lived. And not just hockey, anything he called, he electrified: football, baseball. And he was just a big presence. He walked into a room, you knew he was in the room. That big booming voice. John was talking about running into all these people that had listened to his games, and yeah, he got a lot of kids in trouble too. If the Blues had a good third period on the West Coast, the parents were getting up as well. So he impacted people's lives. And Tom, the tragic thing, but it also just speaks to his brilliance, is he did this in 52 years of life. Imagine if he made it to 92, how much he would have impacted this great game of hockey. But he did that in his short time, and God bless the short time that he spent on this earth.
John?
Yeah, I think really the same that Dan said. He was a loyal husband to my mom, Fran. Loved his family, 6 kids, 4 girls and 2 boys. He cherished his summers at our lake house, Lake Claire near Ottawa, Ontario. So he really was a great family man. It's so sad he never got a chance to meet any of his grandkids. He would have 3 right now. That was number one. But also, I think, he was competitive, but he also, I think he wanted to be remembered as a guy, as I said, that treated people the right way, whether it was the elevator operator, the PR director, fans. I mean, I remember countless nights walking out of the old arena with him, out of the Blues locker room to the car, and fans would mob him for autographs. And he signed every single autograph, was always nice to people. At home, Tom, he would always have tons of cassette tapes on his desk to listen to young broadcasters who sent him tapes, because he always wanted to help young broadcasters. And that was also a legacy. I've had a lot of broadcasters come up to me and say that he helped me, he talked to me, he listened to my tape. So I think that's also part of his legacy, that he wanted to give back, aside from being fair and treating people with respect. So I would say those are the 3 things that really come to mind.
And how much fun he would have had he lived those next 30 years with a Stanley Cup in St. Louis in 2019.
Yeah. I always sort of chuckle. I never really talked to him about it, but his first couple years in St. Louis, they went to the Stanley Cup final, as we know. Yeah. The first year with Mr. Buck as the announcer. But he probably was thinking to himself at the time, man, this is easy. This is fun. This is going to happen every year. And lo and behold, it didn't happen again until 2019, from 1970, and ironically, against the Boston Bruins. So, yeah, he loved the Blues, and he would have. I know my mother, to this day, always said and said before they won, I just want one thing before I die, to see the Blues win the Cup. I think a lot of people said that. My mother said that, and I know that my father somewhere was watching that game and was very proud of his team.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Well, guys, any parting shots before I wrap this up? I think hopefully somehow, somewhere, he gets to hear some of your thoughts that you shared with me on this podcast. I do appreciate it very much.
It was a pleasure, and thanks for sharing your kind thoughts as well, Tom.
Yeah, my pleasure, Tom. I've done many interviews about my father over the years, newspaper, radio, TV, podcast. I'm always happy to talk about Dan Kelly. I really am. He was a great father and a great broadcaster.
Hey, you made it to the end. Good for you. Thanks for listening. Please support our sponsors if you can, and if you have a question for our next podcast guest, or have a suggestion on a legend you'd like to hear on the podcast, please visit PAGuideTom.com and click on the Questions for the Legends tab. Video of the podcast is available the Monday after release of the audio. Visit YouTube.com and search for St. Louis Blues Hockey Legends, and please subscribe while you're there. Tom Calhoun here saying thanks for listening, and let's go Blues!